Okay, so we're going to continue on with this talk on speed and power qualities that we were discussing. So we kind of left off being able to talk about some things with jumping and what have you, further kind of looking at some of the important elements as it relates to power. If we look at speed and agility training, so again, just some points that kind of stand out kind of in our programming aspects. Again, the goal is to increase the alactic envelope. So in the vast majority of the sports that you examine, again, expanding on alactic qualities, so that short-term intermediate system is really important as it relates to the vast majority of team sports. Clearly, there's going to be a carryover to plyometrics as it relates to speed and agility. So developing those elastic reactive qualities through the jumps is going to carry over quite a bit. Sprinting is going to be a hallmark thing, particularly if the sport involves sprinting. So again, not every sport involves sprinting on dry land, but even in those sports where that may be not the case, because of the neuromuscular demand of sprints, it does make it a relevant thing to kind of cover just from a neuromuscular demand. Clearly, in a sport where sprinting is an important thing, you do want to look at the distance covered in most of the sports. And again, when you look at most sports, your primary range of sprint is somewhere between 5 and 30 meters, which is clearly right in the realm of acceleration. In sports, there is max speed met. However, max speed in your team-based sports typically falls somewhere between 40 and 60 meters. In track and field, that's a lot different, and we'll discuss that. But in looking at that, that's clearly what you want to be kind of starting to think about, okay? Again, agility drills, and classically what we think of agility drills, again, remember there's just kind of limits to, kind of how far they kind of translate, particularly those that are sort of pre-programmed, meaning that, they have kind of set places to go to. However, there are still skills where there can be carryover there. And again, quality over quantity. And I'm just going to pop up these next 2 points. So again, we talk about when you're doing speed work, it's not metabolic conditioning. I mean, there's a degree of metabolic conditioning that'll take place naturally because you're still working an energy system. But again, you want quality speed work. So for team-based sports, and not, let's say, just for the sprinting non-track and field athlete, somewhere in the range of 180 to 500 meters of volume. You also want to make sure that the rest intervals are appropriate. So approximately a minute for every 10 meters is usually kind of a good starting point. So for instance, if they're sprinting, say they're doing a 60-meter sprint for speed work, they need to rest at least 6 minutes prior to the next sprint, which is going to seem like a long time, but again, for speed purposes, that's what you want. We also want to look at about 48 hours recovery after doing this. You want to kind of think of that more of that 48-hour recovery window. So that's going to be an important thing to look at as well. If you do happen to be doing sprints beyond 60 meters, they recommend then adding some additional time. So that 1 minute for every 10 meters is usually good up to about 60. If by chance, and there's not going to be a lot of instances where you're doing a ton of sprints for team sports beyond that, but then you would add additional time onto that. But 60 meters is usually the place. Every point up to that, a minute for every 10 meters that they're essentially sprinting. We talked a lot about power speed drills in the past. Again, I'm just going to pull up some different variations. Again, these are all used for various purposes. Clearly as a warm-up, these are drills that usually work really well, particularly towards the end of a warm-up leading into your sprinting. They could be done just as a speed session themselves. They're drills that can be used. Again, remember, they don't represent the forces with speed, but they represent the kinematic demands. So they're all various things that could be used. They could be done as a tempo variation for aerobic development purposes. And I tend to stress these a lot also during rehab. So rehabilitation, these are definitely drills that can be used in a progression to sprinting, that can certainly kind of enhance a lot of things. So again, what you see up here, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these are definitely all things. If there's something up here that you're looking at and you're like, I'm not sure what that is, please feel free to ask in class. But these are definitely some of your good options for your power speed work. Again, a word on metabolic conditioning. So again, don't ignore cardiac and aerobic conditioning. Again, it's just, again, how we look to perform it. We want to make sure that the aerobic conditioning is not going to interfere with speed and power elements. So again, doing a lot of middle distance running is really not a way to address this for most team sports. Again, the thing to remember is most field-based sports are alactic aerobic, meaning that the anaerobic glycolytic or lactic acid system many times doesn't play a direct role in the success in the sport, with a few exceptions. But we want to make sure we don't look at aerobic system. Again, make sure we work the energy system that predominates. Both the ATP, PC, and anaerobic glycolytic or lactic acid are both taxing. Both are going to require a 48-hour window of recovery. So this is why you got to be careful when you're doing lactic-based training or anaerobic glycolytic training, because of the fact that it's not considered high intensity. It's actually considered medium intensity, which is fine and can be incorporated. But you still have to realize that it requires a 48-hour recovery. So any time spent done during that, you're not doing the high intense stuff. As far as aerobic work, again, tempo tends to be a really good option for building the aerobic system, particularly extensive tempo, which is running in that 60 to 75 percentile range. Intensive tempo does step up the intensity a little bit. However, intensive tempo, again, starts to get you more in that medium intensity range. So that basically means that you're then going to have 48-hour recovery. You could recover from extensive tempo in 24 hours. So that's something to be aware of as well. And again, if you do want to do some medium intensity running, there's some good options. The split 60s we've talked about in the past. Again, intensive tempos tend to be a better option for that than a lot of classically what we tend to do. If you think of the things like, the 17 runs and stuff like that people do, 300-yard shuttles. Overall, your net speeds in those tend to be a lot slower. So that, typically means that you're not running as fast. The options that I'm giving here with things like split 60s, special endurance runs, and intensive tempo, they tend to overall be ran faster. Again, the key is to run as fast as you can within the confines of the intensities, and those options tend to be better in that regard. So again, just some examples, and we'll talk further about this, but I'm just going to put these up here, and we'll cover these as well. So when you look at the breakdown in sports, so the first number you're seeing is representative of the percentage of the ATP PC, second number is the lactic acid system, and the third number is the aerobic. Now, if you see a 0 for aerobic, it doesn't mean that it's not used. It just means that it's strictly just used as a recovery element, okay? So for instance, in ice hockey, if you're looking here, 80-20-0, 80 ATP PC, 20 lactic acid, 0 aerobic. Doesn't mean that the aerobic system doesn't get trained. It just means that it's strictly as a recovery element. It doesn't have as much of an impact on the actual activity, given the nature of the sport and how it's carried out, okay? So again, take a kind of look at these. It kind of gives you some idea in as far as, how you could kind of break down the energy systems and their different contributions. This is kind of a neat infographic, and you may even want to just pause this and just kind of look at this and take it in a little bit. But what this tells you is that it's kind of a progression when you're kind of looking at speed throughout an entire training year. What this kind of tells you is kind of the volume of work dedicated to a training component and kind of what it means the closer and closer you get, say, to a season, or as you try to progress from general to specific. So in looking at this infographic, you see here, so in very general training, you look at general fitness qualities, strength, aerobic ability, so on and so forth, with submaximal accelerations. And that's why, like, again, sprinting is a skill. If sprinting is a significant portion of what an athlete is going to be doing in their sport, it is something that should be really worked on kind of throughout the year. In the case of early on in the off season, or in the case of somebody who's just beginning training, they don't represent a big portion, but they're there. As you see the progression going from general to specific, you see general fitness qualities taking less of a priority, and you see all these other qualities gradually building and adding additional qualities. So this is kind of another just example. Like I said, you can pause this and look at it. I think it kind of provides a really nice visual as to how things progress over the course of time, whether it's within an individual training program over the year, or just even how individuals typically progress. The idea being that as people go year to year, so say you're working with somebody long term, the general fitness qualities, again, that's always going to take up a big portion of early off-season training. But as time progresses, the longer and longer you work with somebody, hopefully you're able to limit that and maybe even bring some other things into there as they progress, okay? Because you don't always want to keep building general fitness all the time. Hopefully they have that and have that as a framework. So for instance, say you're working at a university and you get your freshmen in, you're building this. Hopefully by the time they're sophomores, juniors, maybe the block, the representative block early on now looks more like this one. And not that you're necessarily starting with these two qualities, but maybe submax acceleration starts to take on a bigger block of that. That's what you hope to try to progress to over time. You're always going to have to revisit general fitness qualities with people, but the hope is that, particularly if you're working with them long term, that tends to become shorter and shorter over time. Again, just some general mistakes as it relates to speed and power training, and how sometimes those qualities aren't optimized. Again, typically too much volume. Again, it's not conditioning in the sense of metabolic conditioning. We're trying to develop a quality that requires very short efforts, very long recovery. Again, typically, it's that whole quality over quantity thing that we discussed. Insufficient recovery being too much of a thing. Again, too much, all sports in general, and even sports where you think medium intensity running is more impactful, we tend to spend too much time in that medium intensity zone, and that's something to be considered. And that's what we look at here. Again, too much emphasis on lactic training. So again, the types of running and aerobic testing tends to be a little much. Again, is it really relevant to the sport? In most instances, no. And we're going to look at later on, after this next exam, we're going to be looking at, again, time motion analyses and really being able to kind of dissect what that means as far as the sport. Again, does that mean that it's bad for a said athlete, let's say a soccer player, to go out and do, just every once in a while, run a mile? No, it's not. But the vast majority of their training and whatnot shouldn't be primarily focused on that. And that's kind of the bigger take-home point there. And that kind of sums up the rest of this. So again, you might want to go back, like I said, if you didn't, again, look at some of the stuff on that graphic that I showed you. I think that could be helpful. And again, if there's something that you don't remember about, like different types of runs and whatnot, bring that to class when we go to, just kind of do a general overview on things, but make sure if there's anything you're unsure of that you bring that up in class.